Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilvin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and this is part 3 of my Kobolds and Catacombs card review. 9 new cards were just revealed, including 2 new Legendaries, so there's some pretty exciting stuff this time around. Now, as always, up first I'm going to be doing some detailed reviews, but if you're just looking to see the new cards and you want my really quick 5-star ratings, you can hit the link in the description that'll take you right to my quick reviews at the end of the video. But hopefully you'll stick around right now as I jump into my detailed reviews. Up first, I have the new Hunter Legendary minion. This is Kathrena Winterwisp, a new 8-mana 6/6 with a battle cry and death rattle that both read Recruit a Beast. Now, this is a use of the recruit keyword, a new keyword. This is essentially the, Barnes or Yasharaj style effect where something is pulled from your deck and immediately put into play, and in this case specifically, it's a beast. Any random beast in your deck is selected and put into play both when you play Kathrena on the board and when she dies. So, of course, the dream, right, as we saw in the reveal video, is King Crush and Savannah Highmanes and some giant beasts that are available. You can do some pretty crazy stuff in a big hunter kind of list where you're just guaranteed to play a 6/6 that summons a Savannah Highmane or a charging 8/8. That's kind of ridiculous, and then when it dies, it summons another Savannah Highmane. That is a huge value bomb for 8 mana. The risk or the downside with Kathrena, of course, is that she could also technically summon an alley cat if she were included in a hunter list as we understood it today. Because for hunter to succeed right now, it absolutely has to run those cheap beasts, the alley cats, the crackling razor maws, the bear sharks, all of that smaller stuff is the only way Hunter can survive into the late game to get to those Savannah Highmanes and to get to Kathrena Winterwisp. So I do think there's a little bit of a challenge here for Kathrena. She's not going to work in like a traditional mid-range Hunter list as the top of the curve, because if she does just summon an alley cat twice, that's not a very strong 8-mana play, and this card just wouldn't make the cut. You'd be better off running something like Lich King instead. So clearly there's going to require some manipulation of your deck in order to make her work, specifically only running really high cost, high value beast minions. And because she recruits specifically a beast, that does give you a lot to work with. It gives you some options because you can still run low cost minions, you can still play things on curve, you can still fit this in a mid-range list. It's just going to have to be a list that doesn't utilize beasts. You're going to have to go into the neutral pool of cards and try to piece together an opening and mid-game curve that keeps you alive in combination with, non-minions like Animal Companion and Eaglehorn Bow and all those sorts of things that allow you to get to Kathrena. And then if you do get to Kathrena, and you have, 4, 5, 6 beasts in your deck, all of which are giant high-cost things, then suddenly Kathrena becomes really, really, really powerful. And that's a kind of scary world to live in. So I do actually think there can be a list that's good enough using neutral minions and non-beast minions to get to these sorts of plays, and then just has such a strong late game with all the Highmanes and the Crushes and everything else that, by God, you can actually win some games. You can do some crazy control style, high value kinds of plays. Hunter also has, shot spells, all the removal tools in the mid game, like the multi-shots and the explosive shots, and of course there are also traps as well. So you can put together a solid curve and a decent list without early game minions, I think. And of course there might also be some new supporting cards coming out in Kobolds and Catacombs that we just haven't seen yet that also play into this game plan. So I think Kathrena Winterwisp certainly has some potential. When she works, she's going to be just insanely powerful. It's just, can you build a deck that supports her? So fundamentally, to me, a very strong card. Whether or not she's playable or is going to make an impact in Hearthstone's meta right away, that's going to have to just take some time and we'll have to see. But I think ultimately, just from a value standpoint, from a cost standpoint, from a playability standpoint, Kathrena Winterwisp checks all the right boxes. So now let's move on to a card that isn't very good. This is the new Shaman legendary weapon, the Runespear. A little sad they cut off Bloodhoof Runespear, which is really the name of the weapon pictured here, the Cairn Bloodhoof family weapon. But this is the Runespear, an 8 mana 3/3. It's a very low stat allocation for an 8 mana weapon off the bat, so this effect has to be good to make the Runespear good. Unfortunately, I don't think it is. The effect reads, after your hero attacks, you discover a spell and you cast it with random targets. So 8 mana 3/3. That's basically about a 4 mana weapon, probably based on the 3/3 itself. So you have to assume the effect here is worth about 4 mana total. And theoretically, if you did cast multiple spells, on average they would probably cost much more than 4 mana. So if everything worked out in a dream scenario, it would work out okay over multiple turns, that the Runespear would kind of pay for itself from a mana cost standpoint. There are clearly some fundamental problems in that logic, though. First and foremost, it takes 3 turns to return that value. So this is an incredibly slow and, of course, risky play when you look at things like weapon removal in Hearthstone. So, you might really only get 1 attack and 1 spell a lot of the time, which is dreadfully terrible for 8 mana. That's just far too little of a return for that much expense, unless you hit like exactly the spell you need, like a Volcano or something that's absolutely perfect. So pretty risky, pretty slow card. When it high rolls, it could be okay, but that means you have to get exactly the spells you want, exactly the board states. You have to already be at a state in the game where you're not just absolutely lost already because you have 8 mana to play. So it's almost a win more card that's good a very small percentage of the time. Because if you look at the Shaman spells, and I went through and I looked at all of I think there's basically 29 eligible spells right now in standard format, a couple extra probably with Kobolds and Catacombs, sure. But if you look at those spells, I broke it down into like a few categories where if you discover this spell, it's always good. It's not conditional. For instance, something like Call in the Finishers. It's going to always summon you some 1/1 bodies. Like, that's always good. It always does something in a positive direction. There are other cards that are usually or sometimes good without a chance to backfire. Things like Bloodlust, for instance. Like, that could be good if you had a huge board of stuff. That would be fantastic. But other times you might not have any minions and it's just completely useless. So it's sometimes good, but it never buffs your opponent's board or hurts you actively in a way. So that's a non-risky, sometimes good card. And then there are a ton of spells. Like, a vast majority of the pool are cards that are sometimes good and sometimes really bad. In other words, just think of any sort of lightning bolt, for instance. Yes, it could hit something on your opponent's side of the board, but it could also hit you or one of your minions. So it has a huge chance to backfire. So if you break it down sort of in those groups and you look through the spells, you'll start to realize really quickly that a vast majority of the time, probably something like 22 out of 29 times, you're going to get a result that doesn't work very well for you or has a ton of risk, something that you just can't pick in good conscience. So it's just, Runespear essentially, it takes everything lining up to absolute perfection to make this card okay. And even then, it's just okay, which means every other time, it's absolutely abysmal. It's awful. It's too risky. It's too slow. It's just fundamentally not good. It doesn't do enough. There's not enough Farsights and Call in the Finishers and just trustworthy spells to cast off Runespear. The rest of the time, nothing lines up the way you want it to. It's just too random, too uncontrolled, too expensive. I absolutely hate everything about the Runespear, frankly. There's just nothing redeemable about this card to me. It doesn't make any sense. For instance, just compare this card to like Medivh, to bring up an example. Medivh, same cost, but you get a 7/7 minion guaranteed, and you're still using your spells in a targeted way, and you're getting a minion out of them every time. Like, there's guaranteed upside from Medivh. Like, it's always going to do what you want and in a controlled fashion. The Runespear is the exact opposite direction. You get a measly 3/3 guaranteed, and everything else is up for grabs. So it's like a reverse Medivh that's worse in every imaginable way. I kind of just absolutely hate Runespear. I think this is a terrible card in the actual game, but also just a terrible card from like a design and execution standpoint. I don't want to hate on Blizzard too much, but I really don't know what they were thinking here. The Runespear is awful. So now let's move on to a card that isn't terrible. This is a new priest minion named Duskbreaker. It's a 4-mana 3/3 dragon, and it has a really nice little battle cry. It reads, if you're holding a dragon, deal 3 damage to all other minions. So this is essentially And Excavated Evil, if you remember that card from League of Explorers, also a priest card, but it's attached to a body and it only costs 4 mana. So Excavated Evil was a playable card, a similar kind of card as Hellfire. Of course, this doesn't do face damage, but it's still the same idea. Usually Hellfire, and most importantly, clears minions. I think another interesting comparison for Duskbreaker is something like Auchenai Soul Priest plus Circle of Healing. That's a 4 mana card that traditionally has helped Priest recover a swarming board state in the mid-game. And that was really their only tool, and it wasn't that fantastic. Otherwise, you have to go to Holy Nova or Dragonfire Potion these days, which are a little late sometimes, and Holy Nova in particular just doesn't often do enough because minions are usually much bigger than that. But Duskbreaker gives you an earlier, pretty solid, nice little board clear, which is something that Priest can use really, really well. Now, obviously, you do have to have a dragon in your hand, so this is not an everyday Priest card. This wouldn't necessarily fit in something like Raza Priest. This would probably have to be played in a very dragon-oriented list, because clearly Duskbreaker is only good if you're able to utilize this Battlecry. Something like Draconid Operative, you know, occasionally you wouldn't hit the Battlecry on that, but it's still 5 mana 5/6, that's okay. 4 mana 3/3 just doesn't make the cut. That's not strong enough from a stat standpoint to be good without the Battlecry. So clearly has to be in a deck that always hits this dragon condition, otherwise it fails. And we have seen Dragon Priest picking up steam recently on even the Legend ladder, kind of the mid-range dragon list that rides on Kobold Scalebanes in particular, has seen a lot of popularity. But Duskbreaker changes the direction of that sort of list a little bit, because right now Dragon Priest, and really even the Dragon Priest of old, was very reliant on playing minions out on curve and playing with initiative and playing those really big, meaty sorts of dragons and just leveraging that board position to just pressure your opponent and make favorable trades and then get value out of Priest hero power. It was never really a super comeback deck. It wasn't control-oriented or wasn't reliant on removal spells. Now, clearly, they've always had Dragon Fire Potion as a dragon deck tool, and things like Shadow Word Death and Shadow Word Pain, of course, too, for removal. But it wasn't a control-based deck, right? But with something like Duskbreaker, you can sort of change the alignment there a little bit. You can play a little more control. If you don't get that perfect opening early curve, you can still play Duskbreaker on 4 and swing the board very heavily in your favor, and that's really powerful. Plus, you can just use it sort of a stabilizer later on. If your opponent plays some small stuff and you're ahead on the board, like, yeah, you can hurt your own stuff, but there are plenty of ways for Priests to heal their own minions, so that's not that risky. Compared to something like Warlock and Hellfire, for instance, they don't always have ways to recover that health, but Priest clearly does. So this even synergizes with sort of the core mechanic of Priest, which is healing. So what all that means is that you've got a card that fits its class very well, that is fundamentally strong, just, you know, a board clear attached to a body like this is absolutely fantastic. It synergizes with an archetype that's right on the edge of being tier 1, all of which to me point towards Duskbreaker being an incredibly valuable card moving forward, and probably a really important piece to the Dragon Priest puzzle as well. So I think this card will absolutely see some play. And then up next I have a new Druid spell. This one's called Branching Paths, a 4 mana spell that allows you to choose twice. Instead of just choosing an effect once, Branching Path essentially pulls up 3 different options: draw a card, give your minions +1 attack, or gain 6 armor. Each of those are put on your screen much like a Discover effect. And then you pick one of them, and then the same 3 options are presented again, and you pick a second one. So you can pick the same one twice. You can get any mix of the 6 that you'd like. And that means to me that Branching Paths is a really nice little card. It's incredibly flexible, and it can just do the thing you need it to do in any given different board state. So, I mean, if you look at each of these sort of comparisons, right, if you draw a card twice, that's clearly a little worse than something like Arcane Intellect. But if you're just really desperate for cards and you're in a pinch and you have to draw, then hey, 4 mana for 2 cards really isn't that bad at the end of the day. Alternatively, if you give your minions +1 attack twice, that's kind of like a Savage Roar, right? Because you're getting +2 attack to everything on the board except for your face, unlike Savage Roar. So a little bit worse of a Savage Roar, right? It's kind of a 4 mana Savage Roar with a little bit of downside. So not as good as, you know, the fundamental cards like Arcane Intellect or Savage Roar in these cases. You're kind of paying a penalty, but that's what you're paying for, the flexibility. And then finally, gaining 6 armor twice. That's a total of 12 potential armor for 4 mana. When you look at it that way, that's actually quite a bit better than something like Feral Rage. A little less flexibility because you don't necessarily get the attack. But altogether, you can piece this together. You can draw a card and gain 6 armor. That's a little bit worse than Shield Block. You're kind of paying a 1 mana penalty over a card like Shield Block. So if you look at it from a raw mana standpoint, it might look a tad overcosted. But of course, that flexibility is insanely valuable. If you hit a big Spreading Plague and your opponent couldn't answer it, the +1 attack could make all the difference. That could give you lethal. You could just buff those things up to 3 attack total and just kill your opponent. If you're in a desperate pinch for life and you absolutely have to stay alive, hey, there's 12 armor. That's really nice. If your hand is empty, draw some cards. Combine any of those together for a middle ground sort of solution. To me, Branching Paths does a lot of cool things. Does it pretty efficiently. You're not as efficient as single-use cards, of course, but still, it's not incredibly overcosted. Like, I think there's an argument that this card could be 5 mana, frankly, just to pay for all that flexibility. But at 4 mana, it feels really strong. It feels good. I think this is the kind of thing Druid could easily run. Now, that said, based on the decks we have right now that are popular for Druid, Jade and Token, I'm not sure either of those decks would want to run Branching Paths, just because I think their lists are pretty well refined, and they have incredibly specific game plans that they're looking to achieve, and a card like Branching Paths might not necessarily fit those, although I bet Jade Druid could find a place for a card like Branching Paths pretty easily. So we might not see this seeing play right away. Might be a card that has to wait until the next rotation, but I think just looking at it from a raw power level standpoint, it looks quite strong, very flexible, fairly efficient. So even if it doesn't see play right now, as soon as Kobolds and Catacombs hits, because we have some pretty refined archetypes in Druid, I think as other cards move out, you'll see Branching Paths move in and become a more fundamental piece to the class. So I have a lot of hope for this one moving forward. I think this is a nice card. So now let's move on to a new Paladin spell. This is called Level Up, a 5-mana spell that gives your Silverhand recruits +2/+2 and Taunt. So, I mean, most notably, I think this compares to Quartermaster, that old card, if you remember it, which also gave your Silverhand recruits +2/+2. It was a card that saw a little bit of play, which I think is now also pretty popular in Wild format. I think Silverhand recruits is a good deck. Recruit Paladin, essentially, or they might have to change the name of that because recruit's a keyword, but Dude Paladin is a fairly good archetype in Wild, but clearly not something that has gained much popularity in Standard format. There just aren't enough things like Muster for Battle to summon dudes right now in Paladin to make this card, or like Light Fuse Stegadon, all that relevant. I've experimented with it some and had some fun, and it wasn't absolutely terrible, but not tier 1 material by any means. And unfortunately, Level Up just doesn't change that, because really the problem right now isn't buffing your dudes or leveraging your dudes. It's getting the dudes to stick around in the first place, right? There is a card like Stand Against Darkness, which can summon a lot of dudes, but they just die so easily to so many things. They take terrible trades into boards. Maelstrom Portal and any Whirlwind effect wipes that out immediately. So for a card like this to work, you really have to combo it out in like a single turn, right? You'd have to Stand Against Darkness plus Level Up. And that's a 10 mana play that even then really only gets you 15 in stats that's still very susceptible to board clears. That feels kind of terrible. Now, in Wild format, I don't know Wild format really well enough to say for sure. These reviews are always more Standard format based. I suspect Level Up would be halfway decent in Wild format based on my understanding of those lists right now. I'm not sure it's better than Quartermaster because I don't know that the Taunt matters, and that 2/5 body from Quartermaster could just be better than Level Up, but there might be room for both, right? You could theoretically just run more consistent dude buffs and benefit more consistently from those buffs. So I don't think Level Up currently has any hope in Standard format. This looks like a throwaway card. It's pretty slow, way too unpredictable, and actually hard to pull off. Like, usually you just get 1 or 2 dudes, and a 5 mana +2/+2 is not very good. Even a 5 mana +4/+4 is worse than Blessing of Kings because it's so strict in how you utilize it. So it really would take 3 or 4 dudes to make Level Up even remotely worth it. And then at that point, like, how are you getting 3 or 4 dudes on the board to stick? What deck is that? Is it better than alternatives that Paladin has access to? All of which I think don't make sense. This just doesn't work. So a little too expensive, a little too low of a payoff for standard format in particular. I think Level Up will be a fairly disappointing and unseen card in standard, although perhaps okay in wild format. So now let's move on to a new warrior spell. This is another of the Spellstones. We've seen a couple of these already. This one's the Lesser Mithril Spellstone, a 7 mana spell that summons one 5/5 Mithril Golem. So you get one 5/5 minion for 7 mana, but of course this can be upgraded like the other Spellstones we've seen. And you upgrade this one by equipping a weapon. So if you equip a weapon, this gets upgraded, and I don't have artwork for this, but then you get two 5/5 golems. And if you equip another weapon at that point, when you casted Lesser Mithril Spellstone, you'd get three 5/5 golems, which is the final state of the spell. So right off the bat, at its base level, clearly Lesser Mithril Spellstone is awful. 7 mana 5/5 with no effect is just miserably bad. That's a terrible play. At the second level, Lesser Mithril Spellstone is still probably not good enough. Just two 5/5s that don't do anything, that's not great. Bone Mare, for instance, is the most obvious comparison, right? That's a 5/5 and 4/4 with charge. Now, clearly you do have to have a minion on board to take advantage of Bone Mare, but that has not been a problem in Hearthstone. As we've seen in this meta, Bone Mare works a lot of the time. So worse than alternatives, right? And just worse than other 7 mana cards you might be able to play as well. Just doesn't do enough. Dice to AoE, Dragonfire Potion, boom, your Lesser Mithril Spellstone is wiped out. The third level of Lesser Mithril Spellstone, where you get three 5/5s, a 7 mana 15/15, starts to look okay. Starts to look above average. But I would still contest that three 5/5s for 7 mana just isn't good enough. I don't think that's that great. When you compare that to other plays that are available in Hearthstone in the sort of 6, 7, 8 mana range, where those cards tend to sort of, wash out together, and as far as mana cost is concerned, because you're usually floating mana around those points anyway, wouldn't you rather just have a Cairn a lot of the times on 6 instead of perhaps three 5/5s on 7, just because Cairn gets out earlier, he's a little stickier and more difficult against things like AoE, for instance, because Dragonfire Potion, at least you get the 4 or 5 back. Lesser Mithril Spellstone, when it gets Dragonfire Potioned, it's always completely dead, and there are other AoEs, of course, as well. So a little stickier with things like Cairn. Bone Mare also feels like a better play in a lot of ways. I don't even think in the best case scenario that Lesser Mithril Spellstone is a great card. And of course, that's the best case scenario. The reality of this card is that it's going to be really, really difficult to get it to a best case scenario. How many weapons do you actually have to run for Lesser Mithril Spellstone to make sense? Because clearly this isn't the kind of card you want in your mulligan. Like, you never want to see this card in your opening hand, but for it to get these upgrades, it has to be in your opening, it has to be in your hand. You have to be equipping weapons while it's in your hand for these upgrades to actually proc. So essentially, you need this pretty early in the game in order to not feel bad playing the weapons, because you're going to be wanting to play your weapons throughout the course of the mid-game to keep up with the board. So you need this in your opening hand to actually activate it a couple times. So it's a dead card. You may not even draw your weapons in the early game anyway, or you might just draw one, might feel weird casting a second one, etc. So there's a lot of friction in actually completing these upgrades. It may not always feel good. You've got a dead card in your hand. It feels bad. Sometimes it completely fails. And then, even if everything lines up perfectly, the result is still barely above average to me. So I think Lesser Mithril Spellstone just looks absolutely terrible. I don't think it's going to be played. I don't think it makes any sense. Not enough value. Cost too high. Condition too difficult to meet. I can't imagine any sort of deck that actually makes this work. I think it's supposed to work in like recruit decks, because recruit decks you want to essentially have very few minions, sort of the big mentality, big priest mentality, where your recruit is guaranteed to pull out something big and awesome or something targeted, and you need other cards to fill in the gap so you actually have minions to play. But I don't think Lesser Mithril Spellstone is good enough to satisfy that need for this recruit style deck, and I suspect even the recruit style deck wouldn't make a lot of sense either. So I just don't see this one working. I don't see a home for this card. It just doesn't feel very good, and in fact, feels pretty bad. So now let's move on to something crazy. This is a rogue secret. That's right, rogues are apparently getting 3 secrets in Kobolds and Catacombs, which is pretty interesting because that's a large portion of the total card pool available to rogues, right? Like, that's a pretty good little chunk of all the cards they're going to get. So we will see 2 of which in this review, by the way. The third one is as yet unrevealed, so we don't know what the third rogue secret's going to be. But clearly, they have to put a few secrets in for it to make sense. Otherwise, they're not very secret, right? If there's only 1 or 2, you have a pretty good chance of guessing what it is. But that does still expose a pretty interesting sort of catch-22, right? In that to run these secrets, or if these secrets are going to become sort of popular in the meta, they're probably going to have to come in a group. Because otherwise, you're always going to know what secret it is. In other words, if only one of these is good enough to ever be played, then you're going to know every time you play a rogue that that is the one secret they're playing. So it gives you a lot of power over controlling that secret and playing around that secret and understanding exactly what that secret's going to accomplish or do for them. So that's a lot of risk. So basically, at least 2 of these have to be good, and probably 3 have to be good for them to make a lot of sense. If hunters only ever ran Freezing Trap, you'd always know to play around Freezing Trap. But because hunter secret decks have historically run multiple secrets, it does become a little more challenging. So as I'm reviewing these, I'm going to keep that in mind, honestly. Like, I think these all kind of receive a little bit of a negative point or 2 simply because they're so reliant on the other cards. And the likelihood that 3 cards are really strong in the meta is much, much lower than the likelihood that 1 could perhaps make the cut. So for instance, starting off here with Sudden Betrayal, this is a secret that whenever a minion attacks your hero, instead it attacks one of its neighbors. So this is kind of like Hunter's Misdirection, but instead of a random target after the misdirected attack, this will actually attack the guy, one of the guys next to the minion that attacked. So essentially, Betrayal plus Misdirection. Betrayal and Misdirection had a baby. And we've all seen those misdirection plays where it's really cool that it, hits the minion next to it and they lose 2 minions for only 2 mana. That's fantastic. And if that happens, Sudden Betrayal is very, very good. Unfortunately, there's a lot of ways to play around Sudden Betrayal, and in fact, because it's positioning based, there's even more ways to play around it. Because essentially, your opponent, if they know that you're likely to have Sudden Betrayal up, they know you played the secret, and say they have 2 8/8s out on the board, right? And as it looks right now, when it goes into their turn, it's like, oh, I'm going to kill one of these. I'm going to kill both these 8/8s because they only have 2 8/8s, right? But you're passing the turn back to them after you play this card. So now they have the initiative and the control to play around it. And they can just take that Firefly and plop Firefly down in the middle and then attack with an 8/8, and absolutely nothing has happened. An 8/8 gets misdirected into the Firefly. Now, clearly, there is some value in misdirecting an 8/8 in that scenario because it's like an 8-point heal. So that's okay. But fundamentally, it's not doing all that much because, of course, the 8/8 is still on, the 8/7 in that specific scenario is still on the board. The other 8/8 would still be on the board. So in other words, I think you're giving your opponent too much influence and control over how this card is played out. Like Misdirection, although it's random, can do a lot because it's random. Your opponent can't really control it. They don't have ways to influence how it pans out. And of course, Misdirection is not even a good card. Like, we should make that note. Misdirection doesn't get played. It's not great by any means. So this has to be distinctly better than Misdirection in a lot of ways. And when you give your opponents the influence and the control, like for you, it doesn't really help much that you can kill the Firefly because you're passing the turn back to them. They get to make the last decision. Like, you could try to set up a board that influences Sudden Betrayal in a positive way, but you're always giving the initiative back to your opponent, and they get to make the final decision and the final read on executing the secret. So I think that's just too much of a problem for this one. Also, I just don't think there are that many board states where it really helps that much. Usually this is just a little bit of a heal, I think, is the primary value on this one, just denying that attack, as opposed to a clear, it's like, heal a little bit and chip away some health on some other things a little bit, right? So, not absolutely terrible. I think it's okay. I think it's fine. It's going to be one of those things where if you get it for free, you're able to put it into play for free. It's a nice little bonus. But I just can't imagine this makes sense to run in a deck. Like, I don't think this is good enough to take up a spot in a deck and be a card that you want to draw or want to see. Although, of course, Rogue does have spell synergies, particularly cheaper spell synergies, so there's always that out for a card like Sudden Betrayal as well. If you're just stuffing your hand or your deck with spells, perhaps it could work. But since I don't think it's all that good, like I think I'm probably going to give this card 2 stars when we get to the quick star reviews. Since I don't think it's all that good, that immediately makes the other secrets worse. They're already getting worse, because if you don't want to run Sudden Betrayal, does that mean you don't want to run the other secrets? So that said, let's go ahead and jump into the next secret for Rogue. And this one's called Cheat Death. Of course, another 2 mana Rogue spell, a secret. And this one reads, when a friendly minion dies, return it to your hand. It costs 2 less. Now, I do think Cheat Death is much better as just a strict card on its own. Like, I think there's a lot of value here. This is essentially like Getaway Kodo, right? We've seen Getaway Kodo. It's a pretty good card in Paladin. You can sometimes force your opponent's hand. They can give you an additional resource, like a second Tyrion. Often, even just like a second Stonehill Defender can be really, really powerful. And on that note, it's not just Getaway Kodo, because it's also reducing the cost of the card when it comes back in your hand. So it's a little bit like a Shadow Step as well. And that is, again, very, very powerful. A 6-mana Tyrion is much better than an 8-mana Tyrion. The question is, does Rogue have enough good minions that it can play to make this valuable? Now, I do think this has less risk than in a class like Paladin, because there are just less little 1/1s floating around that are easy activations for something like Getaway Kodo. Rogue doesn't typically play as much junk. There's always the Fireflies and stuff, but you could control when this is played and build a deck that doesn't run as many of those low-value targets. But, for instance, if an Edwin Van Cleef gets hit by Cheat Death, that's probably pretty good. If a Bone Mare were to get hit, that'd be pretty fantastic as well. There's clearly some targets that we see in Rogue traditionally that make sense. Things like Swashbucklers might not be quite as exciting, but would still be okay, because you get that Battlecry again, you're essentially getting another free card for your Cheat Death, which is nice. So I do think there are clearly some cards, a Keleseth, for instance, would be beautiful to get back off Cheat Death. That would be amazing, but the problem, of course, is that Cheat Death is a 2-mana card, so you can't run it with Keleseth. So you'd have to look elsewhere and build some other things, but SI7 Agents of the World, there are various targets that clearly make a lot of sense here, and probably you want things with like Battlecries or active onboard combos, because those are usually better when their cost is reduced. But I think Rogue, the way it's traditionally built, the kinds of minions it normally runs, has a lot of ways to force your opponent's hand in sensible ways where they only have 1 or 2 targets to kill, and both of those are pretty good for Cheat Death. And with things like Bone Mare, you can kind of even force your opponents to kill those minions sometimes, because they do have taunt. So, all that said, I actually like Cheat Death. I think this is a really good secret. I think this is a pretty cool one. But the risk, as I've mentioned a handful of times already, comes back to the fact that if it's the only secret that's any good, your opponent will know that they're playing against Cheat Death, and to the best of their ability, be able to manipulate that into their favor. But that said, I'm going back and forth here, I do think Cheat Death is a harder thing to ignore. Sometimes you can just force them into it. So I think this one might be good enough as even just a standalone secret. Even if your opponent always knows what it is, sometimes it could still give you a lot of expected value in return, so it would be fine. So I think Cheat Death is actually a reasonable card. The question is, based on the strong archetype of Rogue right now, will this see play right away? Maybe not. Maybe Keleseth Tempo Rogue remains the dominant meta deck for Rogue, so this one could stay quiet for a little while. But as a card in and of itself, I still think it's good enough that it might eventually see some play. And now finally here we have the Feral Gibberer. This is a 1-mana 1/1, and this one reads, after this minion attacks a hero, add a copy of it to your hand. So the idea here, of course, you play this guy out, and on turn 1, for instance, and your opponent doesn't have an answer right away because they're not a ping class, you attack face, and you get another Feral Gibberer in your hand. And I think a lot of people are going to kind of scoff at this card and say, oh, it's like a meme card or a cute card. It's a throwaway. It's the wretched tiller of Kobolds and Catacombs. But I actually sort of think this card might be good. And hear me out here, right? There's a lot of times, if you play fast decks, there's a lot of times those minions you play on turn 1, they just survive. Like, your opponent just doesn't have that answer to whatever specific card you played, the Alley Cat of the world or Firefly or whatever it is. Sometimes they just don't have anything to do. Like the ping doesn't, some pings just don't answer a card like this. Sometimes they don't have another minion. And I think, basically 40-50% of games, Feral Gibberer might actually get to attack. And I think that sets off a really interesting chain reaction where you essentially always have this very flexible card that a lot of the time reproduces itself and puts itself back in your hand. And that means that you're never floating mana. You're always sticking out this sort of pseudo threat onto the board that's like, God, I've got to deal with this Feral Gibberer eventually. So I think it can create some friction and some frustrating moments for your opponent. And it's the kind of thing that can snowball if they're not careful. So if they don't have an answer on 2, now you have a couple Feral Gibberers. Now, obviously, this isn't the thing that works in every kind of deck, but specifically in something like Token Druid that is very good at utilizing small minions and buffing them and making them frustrating to deal with, I kind of think Feral Gibberer could make the cut. Just having that extra 1/1 to play that's super flexible and, you can just drop it and it fits your curve perfectly with Power of the Wild or that Mark of the Lotus on turn 2 or whatever it might be. Just having that continually refills your hand and replenishes itself just to fill in the next floating mana point. And to get that one extra buff on the next buff card or to buff your Crypt Lord. It has the potential to snowball and be very powerful and just become very frustrating. And just, Token Druid, one of the risks is that you run out of cards eventually. Feral Gibberer kind of helps you combat that risk. So I'm not saying it's going to be a guaranteed one-of in Token Druid, but I can see that it's the kind of card that kind of fits that playstyle. So if a certain deck list or a certain meta aligns itself where, maybe the hero power classes like Mage and Rogue and Druid that do ping hero powers, maybe if those become less dominant than they are right now, Feral Gibberer, for instance, could really excel in that sort of meta where it's less likely to be contested via a coin, hero power, or whatever other spell. So, essentially, probably not a really strong card, right? Never going to be a meta-defining card, but the kind of thing that you shouldn't be too surprised if this pops up here and there in certain token-style lists or swarm-style lists, zoo-style lists even, where Feral Gibberer just really helps fill in those curves and gives them extra bodies and extra stats, essentially for free because you're floating mana. You weren't going to spend it anyway, so it's sort of a free body. Might get 3 or 4 Feral Gibberers, and occasionally you might get 10 or 20 if your opponent just can't answer that early swarm. And I think that's a really interesting mechanic that might just be halfway decent. So certainly keep an eye on this card. Next up, I'm going to be doing my quick reviews where I rate each of these from 1 to 5 stars. So let's go ahead and jump into those quick reviews. Kathrena Winterwisp is a 4-star card. The Runespear is a 1-star card. Duskbreaker is a 4-star card. Branching Paths is a 4-star card. Level Up is a 2-star card, but if you're a wild player, certainly keep this one in mind. Lesser Mithril Spellstone is a 1-star card. Sudden Betrayal is a 2-star card. Cheat Death is a 3-star card. And finally, Feral Gibberer is a 2-star card, although I desperately want to give it 3. And there you go, guys. That wraps it up for part 3 of my Kobolds and Catacombs card review. Of course, I want to hear your thoughts on these cards. Which ones do you think are going to be great? Which ones do you think are going to be terrible? I'd love to see your insights and see why you guys think what you think. You guys always teach me just as much as I teach you. So, of course, leave all those thoughts in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, game on.